computer. Sorry, I cannot multitask. I'm not very good at that. That's why I've got my wife beside me. Tonight, we have Dr. Matt Springer. He is the man in the state of Kentucky when it comes to dealing with wildlife and the issues thereof. So, Doc, I'm going to turn it over to you so you can tell these fine folks how we can control the wildlife that we encounter in our backyard.
Thanks, Philip. Good evening, and I hope everyone's doing well. So Philip had reached out to me a couple weeks ago, letting me know that you guys had a ton of wildlife-related questions as you've gone through this series. So I'm hoping that tonight I'll be able to answer the majority of them. But if I don't, I will absolutely, at the end, talk to whoever wants to talk about their problems or what they expect to have in the next couple of months. Because I am doing the same thing. I moved to a new house. I'm getting my garden ready. So Rick, I got a ton of questions for you. But I'm starting to prepare for what I'm going to be dealing with in the very near future. And it can be daunting at times, unfortunately. So let me share my screen here. And someone let me know if they are not seeing one of the title slide.
I have it. I love that movie.
Yes, I am still young or old enough, I guess, to know what this movie is. None of the students in our school know what this movie is anymore. It's unfortunate. But I like to have it as my screen whenever I'm doing nuisance wildlife talk on my title slide here, because I think it's a very fitting analogy to how we are going to be dealing with things in wildlife and gardens, unfortunately. So kind of frame this to give you perspective of wildlife in the state of Kentucky. We have just over 500 different species of wildlife in Kentucky, ranging in size from frogs, toads, salamanders, all the way up to elk and bear. The way we manage wildlife in North America is as a public resource. There's several reasons we do that, but it is managed across the state and federal agencies to preserve and enhance the resource at this time and for future generations. And part of that is to conserve the species we have. We do acknowledge that there are species that cause a lot of problems in our everyday life as we try to either grow fruits and vegetables in our backyard, produce crops to feed the world, to try to take an airplane and put it in the air. We encounter a lot of different wildlife related issues. So there's a trade-off here that we try to find a balance on how to promote wildlife species and yet realize that there's a pragmatic solution that is needed in a lot of cases so that we can coexist. And from that, we've learned that, we're really unable to eliminate all wildlife from our backyard, our house, our yard, our row crop situation. Lots of money and time and man hours were spent trying to eliminate predators from the landscape. And all we've done is now see coyotes are everywhere, despite our best efforts. Many of our pest species, or what we commonly refer to as pest species, are doing just as well now as when we try to implement a ton of different management strategies. And unfortunately, that's going to probably continue. So we kind of need to change our perspective on how we deal with wildlife. We've kind of realized this professionally about 30, 40 years ago that, we has spent a lot of money and time trying to get rid of problems, and unfortunately, they're not going away. So we switched gears and started to devote time in learning how to promote and solve these problems by coexisting through a couple different means. And we're going to go through that list here that came out of that change in thinking to help you kind of deal with what wildlife issues you may encounter in your situation. And it really comes down to, we need to learn to live with wildlife by either making a few alterations in our lifestyle, which can go a lot further than we ever think, to deal with many of these wildlife problems. It both prevents the problems and usually helps wildlife. And the example I like to use with this is one that we're seeing increase of in Kentucky as their population is recovering is black bears. Changing a few things that we do has an extraordinary impact on black bears. Whereas when we try to actually treat the black bear, we go out and we haze it, we shoot it with bean bags when it's getting into trouble. That's already almost too late to solve the problem. The problem with black bears is usually solved on the front end, where we're not leaving trash out. We're not leaving a lot of food out, dog food out. We're keeping our trash locked up. We're not putting it out till it gets picked up. Those actually solve a lot more of the problems than going out and hazing the bear. So try to keep that in mind as we go through this of when you approach your problem, how can you change things personally first, because it is a lot easier to change what we do than it is to change what wildlife do, because when it comes down to it, is they're just trying to survive. Unfortunately, a lot of what we're going to talk about in terms of tactics to deal with wildlife problems, you have to actually know what species is causing that problem. And when there's 500 or so species of wildlife in Kentucky, that can be daunting. Fortunately, about 180 to are breeding birds that are passing through Kentucky at some way. Another 100 are passing through during the winter through migration period. So we can knock out about half of those right off the bat, as they're not going to even be a problem at all. But that still leaves a rather large number of animals that could be a potential issue. So there's a few steps that you can take on the front end to try to narrow down what species is causing the problem if you can't tell right off the bat. First and foremost, where is the problem happening and what kind of habitat is around that problem? You want to gather as much evidence of the damage that you're experiencing and take in the surroundings and what possibly could get to that issue to cause it. So it's not likely that you're going to have a beaver problem if you're on the top of a hill with no water body within 3 miles. Okay. However, if you're immediately next to a stream or a lake, you need to be thinking that's a possibility. The next step is looking at more the damage, or the next two steps are really looking at the damage itself. We're kind of talking about more plants here. So if we were talking about houses, I would tell you where in the house, right, where the structure, the problem is. But with plants, you want to look at, where did this plant get damaged? Is it close to the ground? Is it the fruiting bodies? Was it in the top of the tree? Sometimes we see damage on bark that's 2/3 the way up a tree. And this kind of helps you gauge what the perpetrator could be. Low in the ground isn't as helpful. However, something that's midway or to the top of the tree narrows things down quite quickly. Next, we want to look at actually what does that damage look like? Is it a bite on the plant? Is it a tear? Did they mow the tree to the ground? Did they fell the tree? Is there a caching? Did they grab a whole bunch of things and pull it to the ground and then pile it up? All these will help you kind of build a dossier in a way of what to research after you pull it all together. Finally, you always want to look around for tracks, scat, other evidence specific to certain wildlife, things like dams, lodges, holes in the ground, claw marks on buildings or trees. All these are pretty unique identifiers for certain species. However, you have to keep in mind that just because they're there doesn't mean that's your actual perpetrator. It just means that animal frequents the area and therefore it could be the perpetrator. We have resources available that help you deal with, I found a pile of scat, right? So here's some poop. Do you know what made this poop? Most folks are not going to know that right off the bat for many of the species. So we do have a dichotomous key that helps narrow things down and at least get you in the neighborhood of potential perpetrators of the poop. So this is available if you want it. It makes life a lot easier for your agents, and if you take a picture of poop, that you have some kind of size reference. Because if they get a picture and they don't know what it is, and they send it to me, the first thing I'm going to ask is, how big is this poop? And if there's nothing there that can tell me that, it gets a lot harder to figure out what is actually in the area and what left that treat. The damage descriptor, in terms of the plan itself, can go a long way because there's certain characteristics that are giveaways. If you look here, and I can't remember if this slide has the circles or not, so I'm going to try to use a tool to draw attention to. Let me see here. So we have two different bite marks here. We got this one, and then we also have this one up here. And these are actually made by two different animals. And this is a planted tree that we did for a reforestation effort down in Breathitt County. And this is part of research for us. And we were looking at the survival rate of these trees once they were planted. And we're trying to identify the potential culprits of potential failure. And what we see here is that top one is a very distinct angular cut of the plant. The first one I circled is very much a grab and tear, more violent to the actual plant. And these are two different feeding animals. Okay. The first one was unexpected, to be honest, whereas the top one is actually a pretty unique characteristic for our cervid, so our deer and our elk. So we immediately knew that a deer or elk browses because they lack upper incisors and therefore always cut at an angle. The bottom one is a little bit trickier, and like I said, it was unexpected. So it was horses. And looks like that's not going to go away. There we go. So my lesson from this is don't immediately assume that it's wildlife causing the problem if you have the potential for unknown suspects. So, follow the evidence. And in this case, we had a bunch of horses walking around in our plots that we weren't expecting to see, but somebody had opened the trailer up and let them out. So the basic guidelines, once you have a problem and you're able to identify what wildlife is causing that problem, this is that switch I was talking about from just the elimination to learning some pragmatic solutions on how to deal with wildlife problems long term without just jumping to the removal aspect. And first and foremost, we always want to start off by asking is this really a problem? Because if the answer is yes, then there's a lot more that gets involved very quickly and potentially costly. And this really kind of comes down to a personal answer or situation. There's some tolerance in terms of losses to wildlife, depending on how much you value seeing wildlife in the area or value wildlife in general. It also could be a perceived versus actual damage issue. And this comes in a lot of times with producers where, folks will see deer in a soybean field and see them eating the soybeans and automatically assume that is reducing their yield. But what research has shown that in a lot of cases, deer eating soybeans will actually increase yield because of compensatory growth. So despite the belief that there's damage going on, the data that's collected is showing that it's actually increasing their yield. But producers have a hard time dealing with that in many situations because it's kind of against logic that when an animal is taking stuff out, that it's not reducing your overall yield. Another good way of looking at this is things like if you see a snake on your back porch, is that really a problem? Well, a lot of folks, it is a serious problem to them because they're either deathly afraid of snakes, concerned about whether or not it's venomous, don't necessarily have the knowledge at that point in time to to identify for sure if it's venomous. So therefore, it is a problem to them. They're going to look for a solution. For folks like me, I'm just like super excited to see a snake and happy to see them, with the understanding that, if it's a venomous species, I'm going to probably try to remove that away from my back porch and get it to somewhere where it will just go along its way, because they're not there to go after you. They're there because there's probably rodents running around your house, like chipmunks, that is a really good attractor for food. So they have a role in the ecosystem. So keep that in mind. And, the best thing I suggest is become familiar with our Kentucky Snake Identification website and try to strengthen your ability to at least identify venomous or non-venomous snakes. So if we go to the answer to this question is yes, we've decided that we're losing, half of our blueberries from our blueberry plants, and I really like blueberries. It's a problem. Then we start making other steps. And the first one, like I said, is to try to alter my behavior. And I gave examples of how to do that in the front end, so I'm not going to really go over it again. Sometimes it's an easy thing. Sometimes it's not possible. So we're going to skip over it and go to, can I alter the habitat or surroundings in that area or on my property to help solve the problem? Realizing that wildlife are attracted to certain types of habitat, it makes them frequent areas more. And therefore, if you remove that and make the area less hospitable to them, they're probably less likely to frequent the area or less likely to use your garden. Taking out habitat features is one step. The other thing is we can alter the habitat by using deterrents, and we'll go over those. We can also alter it using exclusion devices, and we'll go over some of those options as well. And if none of that works, we finally come around to, and it sometimes, despite your best efforts of trying to solve the solution non-lethally, if you still can't solve that problem, then can you effectively trap the animal, the individual or group of individuals that are actually causing the issue that is a problem? That, if you have a raccoon getting into sweet corn, it doesn't mean you trap all the raccoons in the county. You're trapping the raccoons that are using your sweet corn. That's how you effectively remove the animals that are causing the problem, and not just going after all of the species. And sometimes it's harder than others. Effective hunting and trapping is not necessarily easy, especially when you're talk a lot about our predators like coyotes and bobcats and chickens. Sometimes it's very hard to trap those guys or deal with them. And, generally, though, trapping is much more effective than hunting, both in man hours and in targeting the animals that are causing the issue. And keep in mind that when wildlife, this is always going to be a long-term battle. Animals have their own personalities, their own individual athletic abilities per se, and their own ability to problem solve. So what works for some individuals may not work for others. And therefore you kind of have to be nimble and flexible and using multiple methods to deal with them. So let's go into some examples of these other techniques to get a little more into the specifics here. Remembering that, habitat modification is that next step after, altering our behavior. Well, you need to do a little bit of research. Once you identify the individual, you need to know what that individual prefers. What does that species prefer? Look at your landscape around where your problem is and determine if there are things on that landscape that are probably attracting that animal there. Unfortunately, a lot of times we're talking about gardening. Your garden is what is attracting those animals. What we grow for food for us is almost 100% food for wildlife. But there may be other things that are attracting animals more frequently to your property. Bird feeders are a great example of a very highly valued food source that will bring in many species outside of birds because it's such a nutritional value to them. And once they recognize that your house or wherever you have those bird feeders is a food source, they are going to frequent it more often to try to take advantage of that resource. The good thing to keep in mind is that feeding birds in spring and summer and fall is not really going to benefit them a ton. You can take those feeders down, and this is especially true in bear country, is you don't want to be feeding birds in April, May, all the way through to October, because it will attract bears. And you know what the bear's closest cousin is? Raccoons. It's the next closest relative to them. But things like skunks, groundhogs, squirrels, turkeys, many, many more are going to use that food source. So removing that food source is going to go a long way. Other things like rock piles, brush piles, dead snags, trees can be used as denning sites, can be used as cover from predators. And having them near your garden is going to give the ability for wildlife to be close to a food source and close to predator security. So close for them to be cover. And they are just as lazy as humans are sometimes. And if they only have to walk 20 feet from bed to food, that's all they're going to do day in, day out. Why would you do anything else if you can meet all of your needs in 20 feet? These guys are trying to get fat for the winter, and therefore you're making it easy to make that decision for them. Here's a picture I want to share as a great example. So this is a orchard that was planted, and they've done a couple different things in preparation of putting these trees in the ground. Keep in mind that when you put a tree in the ground, you've got vole issues, rabbit issues, deer issues that are all going to be present because deer will eat the branches, the new growth that comes out of it. Rabbits are going to chew on and girdle the bottoms of the trees. Same with voles. So what they did here is they mowed the grass incredibly short to remove cover for the small mammals, the voles, and the rabbits. They actually knocked back those brush piles. If you look on the left part of the screen there, they did some brush hogging to make that distance from the wooded cover to the trees a little bit further. Probably not going to make a huge difference for deer, but for things like rabbits and other small mammals, it will make a difference. And they put tree guards, so exclusion devices around those trees. Notice how I didn't say they did anything for deer, because they couldn't really do anything for deer in this scenario. They have the tubes really for the small mammals and the rabbits. Usually a tree, when planted in the correct site under normal browsing pressure, so a couple bites a year, will actually have a couple growth spurts to get over top of that browsing pressure. That's especially true for our native species that have evolved with a larger herbivore. For non-native species, that may or may not be true depending on which one you're planting. So apple trees tend not to grow very tall, especially if you get the dwarf variety. They're not going to be able to overcome that browsing by going higher. So you may have to think about how you deal with that long term a little bit differently. Other deterrents. So moving past habitat, we're going to go to deterrents now. So these are basically scare devices, okay? There are a lot of different options. Unfortunately, none of them are really a silver bullet. Their effectiveness is going to vary by the species and temporally. So you need to choose the correct deterrent for the species that's causing the problem and understand that animals will habituate to that deterrent over time. So as that time from when you initially put it out increases, if you do not move it or change it in some way, they're going to learn pretty quickly that it's actually not going to hurt them. So you can do a few things to buy yourself more time. You can move that device around, that deterrent around. You can change deterrents. You can change the frequency at which it's making noise. All of those will potentially buy you more time. And the way you need to approach using a deterrent is try to make sure that you're putting it out right when you need it the most. So if you have berries that are almost ripe or other fruit or vegetables that are almost ripe, most wildlife species are going to want that right as it ripens as well. Okay. It's the sweetest. It tastes the best. That's why we like it then. They like it then too. they're going to know it's ripe a day before we do and get to it first almost every time. So as you approach that point, you want to give yourself a couple days on the front end and get that deterrent out to buy you that time when it's most effective, right as you can, harvest it, so that you beat them to it, basically. Keep in mind that certain deterrents, so I have the picture of the coyote up in the top right corner there. The coyote decoy is great for things like geese and waterfowl. It is not great for other coyotes because it'll attract them to try to scare off this intruder. So you're kind of picking your poison here. That's generally the only one that you have to worry about attracting other potential problem species. So there's a couple different, types of deterrents. We have our visual deterrents, and that's really things like your predator decoys, your balloons, the big eyes. It's also things like lasers, and what what these usually are the most effective on are things like your avian species, and very quickly, you may get a couple days of effectiveness with things like deer, coyotes, and raccoons, but they very quickly pick up on it. So, great for visual, for avian, buy you some time, but not perfect long term. Auditory repellents are another one. Think of these as like propane cannons, predator calls, animals in distress. All of those are really effective for a short period of time. Now, propane cannons are one are incredibly effective for avian species, especially for roost sites. If you have roosts around, a propane cannon going off will scare that roost out and usually make it relocate. They will also work on deer, coyotes, raccoon, bear, elk. However, their effectiveness by about 4 to 6 weeks is almost entirely gone. So short-term good, long-term no. Great example of how we would use this for row crops is right as your soybeans are emerging, deer are going to try to hammer them at that point in time for about 6 weeks. If you put that propane cannon in a field or an area that's heavily pressured, it may get those plants tall enough that they can overcome a lot of that browsing pressure. Another example of this that's more, I don't want to say less technical, but a home remedy per se is folks will take a ladder and get a radio and turn the radio on in the middle of their sweet corn field. That'll actually keep coyotes and raccoons away for a couple days. So right as that sweet corn's coming in, you could take a radio out there and just the voices playing on the radio is an auditory repellent. Chemical repellents, when you're talking about gardens, it depends on which one you are trying to use and on what plants. They work sometimes in different ways. A lot of them are adverse taste reactions, so they just taste bad. There's other kinds that, there's hot feet for waterfowl. However you want to be putting those in a garden. Generally what happens is when it's a bad tasting item, right? You're spraying something that's going to make it taste bad. They have to still learn that it's on the plant and that the plant tastes bad. So you're going to get a little bit of damage, but not a ton. Other ones will use smell as the deterrent. They generally don't work as well. But the problem with these kind of chemical deterrents is they're not great for garden situations because almost all of them are not labeled for use on plants that are for human consumption. The exception to that is capsaicin, which is basically just hot sauce that you can use. However, during my PhD, I did a little bit of research on applying it to soybeans to try to keep deer away. And we did a couple different levels, including all the way up to 100 times the recommended dose. So as hot as, think ghost pepper hot, right? We had some deer. We had this one deer that would actually like seek out that plot that had the highest concentration. just like us, some of us like hot sauce. This deer loved hot sauce. So you have that individual personality issue that may or may not cause problems when you're using this. There are some products that are better than others, especially when you're talking about just landscaping plants. Theorem is a great one to keep deer and rabbits away. Keep in mind your cost for these, especially in larger operations. And this is more towards folks that are producers for landscaping plants and row crops. Is you have to look at that benefit cost analysis and see if it's worth it or not in the long run, which is hard to determine. Before I forget, so there's some stuff in here. There's like castor oil products that have been shown to work for moles. Unfortunately, not a whole lot of success on other species. There is some science behind these products. Usually, the company has tested them, and you can actually look at the labels, and they'll sometimes say university tested. It won't say university supported or university approved or scientifically backed, because statistically you get a lot of variation in how effective they are. So it's somewhat unclear of whether or not these are worth their use. And the same kind of holds true for the next group here, where you have the homemade repellents. Some of them work, some of them don't work. Generally, it depends on the situation they're in. And when we talk about science backing, we want to see clear results every time. And when you have a mixed bag, it's hard to recommend them. With the homemade stuff like ivory soap, crushed peppers, or predator urine, the great thing with these is usually they're incredibly low cost. And if you want to try them, they're not going to hurt anything. I just wouldn't, bet the farm on them. So just make sure that you research. We don't want folks putting mothballs out in their garden. That would be a bad thing. So just make sure you research that there's no negative impacts of the homemade repellents, in terms of health for the environment. Now, if we're talking long-term success in keeping some of our wildlife species out, the best thing you can think of are exclosures. They require a lot of effort and sometimes a lot of cost in the front end. But if you do it right the first time, you will have a lot more success over the long term. And usually you got to think about spreading that cost over the long term of how you're trying to fight this battle. There are a couple different exclosure options. You have to think about what you're trying to keep out to make sure you're meeting that need. Keep in mind, deer can jump an 8-foot fence. So 8 foot's kind of the minimum height, because that's about when they get deterred for just a straight up fence. Other animals are very capable of climbing, things like coyotes, raccoons, squirrels, bears. They're capable climbers. Some are really good at digging. So you have to think about whether or not, if I'm trying to keep certain species out, do I need to put that fence in the ground and have it come out towards them by 6-8 inches? Electric is your friend if you have the space to use it safely. A lot of times when we're talking about backyards, especially if you have neighbors close by or kids close by, electric is something you need to be concerned about, so that they don't come up and grab the fence. Young kids grabbing an 8,000 volt fence is not a good situation. Options that exist that are effective, and the plastic fence here. This is 8-foot plastic fence to keep deer out. If that's the only thing you're trying to keep out, this will work. UV breaks it down over time, but it's relatively low cost, but incredibly effective. That's basically deer or elk only. You start getting into the climbing species, or if you have bears around, a bear will just tear this down to the ground in a heartbeat. The electric side, there's two different options. The one in the bottom right here is a 30-inch tall fence. It has one hot wire at 30 inches and another one at 18 inches. And what this will do, I just saw the chat came through here. Eric, I'm going to cover the height right now. And then Regina, I'll get to the muskrats here in 1 second. So 30-inch wire in the top and 18-inch wire halfway up. This is obviously not going to keep a lot of animals out. What you're doing with this fence, because animals can go under it or jump over it, you're actually using it as more of a deterrent barrier. And the way that's done effectively is you're actually training animals to be scared of the barrier, that they don't want to go near it. There's a negative association with it. And what you do is you actually take some aluminum foil, you put some olive oil, peanut butter on it, and put it on that wire so that the animals come up and they actually lick the wire, lick the foil, and get shocked. And if they do this one time, then that thing right there is something I don't want to go near because it hurts. And it will keep animals out. However, if they figure out that they can just jump over it, or they get a little bit braver, they'll get into it. But it works better than you'd expect. But you have to train the animals, so you have to make sure that you have that out there so they learn that it's going to hurt them. The other option, and the one that we think is a lot more effective long term, and this is what we tell producers for fruits and vegetable production, is this offset design, which is the top right two pictures here and the middle right picture. It's really two fences. The interior fence is about 4 foot tall, and it's electric. It's got several lines on it, so you can see there's like 6 or 7 there from the top to the bottom, spaced about every 8 inches. And that bottom line is placed so that it's going to try to keep out the smallest animal that we want out of the fence. It's going to be at like nose level. So think possum, raccoon. The outside fence is 3 feet away from that, and it's about 18 to 24 inches tall, has a hot wire, and there's another hot wire about nose level on the bottom. And a 4 foot tall fence and a 2 foot tall fence are obviously not going to keep deer or elk out. They can jump that in a heartbeat. What we're doing here is playing on a physical trait that they have that is helpful to them in spotting predators, and that is their eyes are located further back, so they can see almost 360 degrees around their body. That ability also kind of takes away their depth perception. So our front eyes are close together, gives us really good depth perception. Theirs are set back further, giving them good peripheral vision, not great depth perception. So they come up to the fence on the outside. They can't tell how far that inside fence is, so they'll try to go under the outside fence and they'll get shocked. They don't know that if they jump the outside one, there's enough space there that they can jump that one and jump the next one like Frogger, right? So what they do is they stop and they don't try. It's also effective on things like, raccoons and possums, because they go up and they get shocked. There's harder for them to climb 2 different things. They tend to get shocked one way or another. Bears, if you have the voltage up past, 8 to 10,000, it keeps them out. Coyotes and foxes that can dig under it generally won't dig under 2 fences in a row to get inside. So it's pretty darn effective. Eric, does that answer your question about the electric fence setup?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Regina, I'm going to get into a little bit more of aquatic problems in about 5 to 10 slides, and I will cover the muskrats then. And if I don't, by the end, you can yell at me and I will cover it. So just remind me if I forget. So let's get into species-specific control and problems. We'll start off with some of our smaller mammal issues. So basically, these are our rodents, our rabbits, so our lagomorphs. And unfortunately, where there's one, there's a lot. And these guys are the bottom of the food chain. They reproduce at really high levels because they get eaten by predators a ton. There's also a lot of them in terms of number of species that have an incredibly diverse diet and live in a lot of different landscapes. So usually there are rodents anywhere in the world that it can support mammals because they're incredibly diverse and adapted to many, many different landscapes. We'll usually see damage from these guys in a couple different ways. They'll get into seeds when you initially plant. Okay, this is things like your granivores, your small mammals, mice, your chipmunks. That they'll consume the actual seeds themselves or the bulbs. Then we'll see, especially with our rabbits and our chipmunks and we'll get into groundhogs later, but sometimes are rats, where they'll actually chew the plant as it's growing. This is especially true for rabbits and voles, and they'll chew it basically right to the ground. We'll see this sometimes with a more diverse number of small mammals when the plants are incredibly young, because the shoots are so nutritious when they're that small. So older plants, though, are generally going to be your voles and your rabbits that are causing the problems. Then we get into when we actually have fruit or vegetables, we get a lot more damage from many, many other species. And they'll generally attack the actual fruiting body itself, or that vegetable. So you're going to be looking for characteristics of the damage, looking for teeth marks in there. How big are the teeth marks? Are they moving the vegetables away, or are they just chewing on them there? Sometimes those guys, like squirrels especially, or rats, will take that and move it away, whereas your smaller rodents, your mice and rabbits, will consume it immediately in the same location. Exclosures basically impossible for these guys. Really, you have cultural practices are going to be your best bet. Keep your grass mode short. With things like your trees and your orchards, you can try to protect them by having a small layer of gravel around the base of the tree itself, or vines. Think in your vineyards. You can till your if your garden, if you have a vole issue, you can and you're starting to see holes before you even plant, you can actually till it up, and that disrupts their tunnel system and generally causes them to leave the area. So those can go a long way in dealing with these guys. If you remove any kind of vegetation at the end of the year, so that these guys have less food available and cover available as they overwinter, that's a really important thing. And any kind of larger cover for things like rabbits and squirrels in the area is going to, if you can get that out, or potentially make it smaller. So take a brush pile and spread it out, so there's a lot of very small brush piles that you can see through. Actually helps quite a bit, because if you can see through it to the bottom, a hawk or a coyote or a bobcat can access it to catch the rabbit inside it. And that brings me to the next point of trying to increase that natural predation. These guys are best controlled by predators. That's why they reproduce so fast. So encouraging raptors, owls to be in the area, foxes, coyotes, bobcats will go a long way. You can do things like adding a perch over top of your garden. Now, remember, this can backfire, and other birds can use it too. So some of our solutions may open new problems, unfortunately, but these can go a long way. Now, keep in mind, if you are trying to promote raptors and natural predation, you really want to take any kind of rodenticides off the table, because they will move up the food chain quite quickly and cause a bigger problem. It's one of the reasons we've seen such a collapse in the barn owl populations across the range. Is they bioaccumulate that anticoagulants quite a bit. About 99% of their diet is what we would call pest mammal species, and they'll eat 4 or 5 dozen rodents a day when they're feeding their chicks. So it works in their system really quickly, but they're really good at catching these guys. Owls and hawks are good at picking off rabbits and squirrels as well, so that's another place that they help. If you have an extreme issue, or you're on the actual commercial production side, there are options with rodenticide, especially for voles, with zinc phosphide. It's labeled for use in orchards and blueberry production. It is not something you want to use in a garden at all. It's quite dangerous. You need to have your applicator's license to use it, and you want to follow label instructions quite a bit. We also want to make sure that if we're talking about rodenticides at all and using rodenticides, you follow those labels to a T. There's a reason they're there. There's science behind why they're there, because they can cause more problems than you'd ever imagine, and it's against the law to not use them correctly. There are options outside of rodenticides for, especially on a smaller scale, for dealing with rodents. Snap traps are quite effective for lawns or small gardens. You want to place those at entrances, burrows, so little holes in the ground. So a ping pong size hole is going to be a vole. A tennis ball size hole is going to be a chipmunk. So choose your trap appropriately. Chipmunks, you can use rat-sized traps. Voles and mice, obviously, you want to use those smaller snap traps. When you're baiting them and deploying them, you have to think that, is there anything else that could potentially grab that trap? So will a robin potentially come along and try to eat the oats and peanut butter on that trap? So in order to avoid that problem, is you can actually take like a shoebox and cut a hole on both sides of it, and you're basically making a trap tube, so that only the rodents can go in and out of that to access the bait. That keeps the birds out. You only need about a 1/2 inch hole on each side of that box for those guys to go in it, maybe a 3/4 inch for a chipmunk. And you'd want to trap until you don't catch rodents for 3 days to consider that a successful removal of rodent species. Moles are another one that pop up, and moles with an M, right? So, and there's a big difference between moles, which are insectivores, and voles, which are eat vegetation and therefore cause more of a problem in gardens. Moles are going to consume your grubs, your worms, and your insects, not the plants itself. However, the tunnels and the hills can sometimes be visually unappealing. Or if their tunnel goes through root systems at the wrong time or place, it can actually kill the plant inadvertently. They're not actually chewing on the plant, but they cause root damage when they make their tunnels, and could lead to those that vegetation above it dying, as you see in that picture in the top left. Dealing with these guys, there are a couple different traps that are available. They do live at incredibly low densities, so usually one vole per 1/2 acre. They're very territorial. The only time they really interact with each other is mating season, or if it's mom and they're young. There are some baits that are effective and actually safe for non-targets, because you use them by putting them in the actual tunnel itself, out of view from anything else. So those are the worm baits that are sold in the box stores. They are quite effective. What you want to do if you're deploying those, or any of the other traps like the scissor trap or the plunger trap, is you want to step on those tunnels and find the area that the mole is currently using, because their territories can be so big, and put those in that area. And then what you do is you step on them, come back a day later and see where they're pushed back up. That's where the mole is active, and that's where you want to put any devices. Castor oil, if you don't want to go the lethal route, and I recommend that you try not to, try to go the castor oil route first. Castor oil in pelletized form has been shown to be effective. That was one of the things that my predecessor Tom Barnes did as a study, and it both reduced the activity of the moles and also saw a loss of activity. So the moles removed themselves from the area. So it is one, and they sell it in a pelletized form to be spread across the lawn. And castor oil is a natural product that it has very little in terms of concerns for the environment or non-targets. So let's move up the chain a little bit to slightly larger skunks, groundhogs. I now have to talk about armadillos and raccoons. These guys are probably the group that are more likely to be a problem in your garden, especially the raccoons and groundhogs. The skunks can cause some issues, but they tend to cause more issues with lawns and digging holes looking for grubs. Raccoons, in my opinion, are the worst wildlife damage species we have in the state. They do more than even deer do, and they also have disease concerns. Not so much for the garden, but more for using hay bales as latrine sites and what that means for livestock. There are, we talked about the exclosures, the electric exclosures. Those will work on these guys. Unfortunately, the majority of them outside of skunks are good climbers. So groundhogs, raccoons are good climbers. Armadillos will dig under. Skunks can be pretty much kept out of most places with a 2-foot high chicken wire fence. They can climb somewhat, but tend not to. So they can be kind of effectively removed by either fencing them out or doing grub treatments in your yard. Remove the food source and they'll be less frequenting the area unless they're walking around looking for a mate, which is the last 2 months here while you're seeing them get hit by cars quite a bit. Trapping is unfortunately the majority of your tool that you're going to have. There's a couple different traps out there. If you're trying to get rid of trap a skunk, they do have a skunk specific trap that encloses them. Or if you do catch a skunk in a box trap, the best thing you can do is calmly and slowly walk up to it, talk to it, and then throw a blanket over it. That's the method that makes it least likely to cause them to spray. They're pretty much blind, so they react to being startled more than anything else. So if you let them know you're walking up in a calm manner, they actually tend to stay relatively calm. Armadillos are another one that are basically not great at seeing things. They also just randomly walk around the landscape and aren't attracted to baits in traps very well. So when you're trying to get rid of an armadillo, you actually put what we call a drift fence up, where you make a wall and the armadillo walks into the wall and they'll follow it to the end. So if you have a fence, a foot-high fence up, you put a trap at the end of each side of the fence, and the armadillo will follow the fence and just walk right into the trap. The raccoons are easy to trap for the most part. They respond to bait incredibly well. They're also really curious, so you can throw a shiny thing in a box and they will go in there after it. With this, you want to make sure you're choosing the correct trap for the problem. There's a bunch of different traps out there, and this holds true for things like coyotes and bobcats as well. There are two main groups. So you have your kill traps and your live traps. Kill traps are things like the body gripping trap, or commonly called the conibear trap, which is in the top left corner there, which folds down on the animal, compresses the body, restricts circulation, or causes the neck to break for a humane dispatch of the animal. It was designed by trappers, especially for things like beavers, otters, and mink. The other lethal traps that we talk about, the snap trap for mice would be considered a lethal trap. There's a lot more live traps out there, so things like your footholds that really are just holding the animal in place. But the go-to for many of our species that I would recommend is always the box trap, because of the ability to open the door and let the animal walk out if you catch the wrong animal. So if you catch the neighbor's cat, it's a whole lot easier to walk over and say, I have your cat in this trap, open the door, and they take it out. It's not such an easy conversation to have if the animal was in a conibear trap. There's some specialty traps that are out there for squirrels and muskrats that'll repeat trap animals. There's also what's called a dog-proof trap, which is the bottom right there, where it's a tube with a trigger in the bottom of it, which is pretty much restricting it to raccoons and possums, where the animal actually has to manipulate the trigger with its fingers to have it go off, and it holds the hand in place in the tube. Sizing is important, so make sure you choose the size that's appropriate for the animal. If you choose a trap that's too small, it increases the likelihood of the animal pulling its hand out of the trap. If you choose a trap that's too big, it can cause serious damage to that animal. And that's not as a humane of a trap. If you choose the right size trap, the bars will close and literally just hold that animal in place with minimal to no damage to the animal at all. So let's move on to birds. And this one's relatively complicated because of the federal protections associated with them and the Migratory Bird Act. So pretty much any species that migrates is federally protected. So crows, vultures, raptors, robins. So with birds, the only ones that really are not protected are your invasive species, so like your English sparrow, your European starling, your American your house finches, or I'm sorry, not house finches, or pigeons. Pigeons are the other one. Outside of that, you pretty much need a permit to deal with them lethally. And you cannot haze them if they're nesting. So you can't cause them to abandon a nest. That's also considered a lethal option because you basically cause them to lose their young. You can haze them around your gardens as long as it's not hurting the animals. So that is kind of how you have to approach this. Is you're just going to have to try to scare them away and do it in an effective manner. Unfortunately, these guys will have interest in your plants at various stages, most of which is going to be at the end and in the beginning. So taking the seeds as you're trying to plant them, and then trying to take what you grew in terms of a crop. There are exclosures that are effective. Netting around or over top of many of your berry plants or grapes will work. You have to really look at, there's some labor entailed. You want to check those nets frequently. If there's a hole in the net, the birds will find it and use it to get in. So you just kind of have to keep up with it. But if done correctly, it will pretty much eliminate the majority of your issues. That, if you're growing at a smaller scale, it's probably not as big of a deal to put netting over top, other than it takes time to initially get it there and you want to make sure it's done correctly. Larger scale, it can be quite daunting, especially for our vineyard producers, where a flock of birds coming through can cause a loss of up to 70% of their crop in a year. So it's difficult. And they tend to use things like lasers, which are incredibly costly, but super effective. Especially if they have them positioned in the right spot over their production area. Backyards, you don't necessarily want to be using a laser. You want to look at those other deterrents that we mentioned earlier and try to use combinations of them to get the effectiveness you're seeking for the time you need. Deer and elk issues, and we're going to touch on bears here as well. You're going to see some damage to via browsing and consumption of the plant material itself, whether that be the plant, the buds, the new growth, the leaves, all the way to the actual crop itself. And then we also have this whole like rut behavior thing where they take their antlers and rub it all over trees to mark and remove velvet and to mark scent on those trees. Bears do this too, where they'll rub on trees as well and scratch them up, and then they'll consume vegetation and fruiting bodies and everything else. With deer damage, elk and bears, you really are looking at exclosure. With bears, it has to be electric. They will tear a fence down, no problem, or climb over top of it. Deer and elk, it's more about a sturdy exclosure that's 8 foot tall. Hunting pressure and deterrence will work over short periods of time. Hunting pressure for deer is incredibly important in terms of long-term management of the populations. Deer reproduce like rabbits. They will maintain or grow their population in many areas over a very short period of time, even with hunting in place. Now, there's exceptions to that. There's some folks I'm sure on here from Eastern Kentucky that we just had a couple repeat EHD episodes. EHD is a very lethal disease, and those populations probably got knocked back in certain areas by as much as 80%. That'll take them longer to recover. But if you're looking at what hunting does, hunting is basically, if it's done correctly, you're removing adult females. You still have to remove about 30 to 40% of the adult females to keep that population level each year. If you're trying to reduce it extremely, you're looking at half or more adult female removed at the time to keep that population moving in the downward trend. Smaller exclosures are also an option. I don't want to overlook that. Things like tree tubes or small fencing to try to protect those younger plants as they initially grow will work quite well. And there's a lot of options out there for those tubes as well, in terms of clear, plastic, all the way up to like barbed wire tubes if you want to get super aggressive. We'll get to the aquatics, and I'll touch on the muskrats here too. So beaver issues are one that's growing across the state. Their population has recovered, and they're found pretty much everywhere now. There's a water body. These guys can cause problems either directly by felling trees or even getting into crops or gardens. They're big fans of turnips and sweet corn or regular corn. The other way they do cause issues is through flooding or erosion, where they build their dams, and they build their dams because flooding an area is how they get to more food, where they can access more bees while they're floating in the water and store more food. So it's a great ecosystem benefit. There's a lot of wildlife species that benefit from having these beaver ponds. However, if that beaver pond is immediately adjacent to your house, then it causes a flooding in your house. You probably think different too. The thing to keep in mind here is as these guys move in and they build they're relatively long lived. And they move in at the 2-year-old stage, 2 to 3, and then they start their own little family. And it takes, a kit 2 years to leave its parents. So you'll have a litter of up to 4 and the 2 parents. So there's 6 beavers there in a year. Then those kits stick around. So you have 6 beavers. Now you have another litter. Now you have 10 beavers before the next kids leave. So that cycle continues. So you can have 10 to 20 beavers in an area pretty quickly within 3 to 5 years that are going to be consuming a lot and also creating a lot of dams. You can look for tracks. Their feet are huge. They're webbed, so they're pretty easily identifiable. Feed piles are also seen. You'll see them chewing on trees and corn. They leave lots of trails. They also leave these castor mounds for they are territorial. Especially now, you'll be seeing those castor mounds. It's mating season and dispersal period, so they defend their territories pretty heavily. The way you can deal with them, there's a couple non-lethal methods that are pretty effective. If you're trying to prevent flooding, you can put tubes in to drain areas, and you can protect them using an exclosure and fence around it. They respond to the sound of running water. So they're going to try to make that sound go away, and they'll put sticks around that sound until it stops. If you build an exclosure that doesn't allow them to get to where that is coming out, like the pipe, then the water will keep running and they won't have any problem. They'll eventually give up. If they're trying to fell certain trees, you can get on the front end of them, put wire cloth up around it to prevent them from chewing through it. You want to be careful because they will cause a severe amount of damage to trees pretty quickly. So if you see beavers moving, you may want to check that area for certain trees that you may want to keep on the front end of things. There are lethal options as well, and this is probably the most effective short term. Unfortunately, if it has beavers today and you get rid of them, it'll probably have beavers in a year or two again. So it depends on your options and what you want to do. There's multiple trapping methods. They're relatively easy to trap. Just be careful and some of those traps, because they're larger animals, beavers can get upwards of 70 pounds to 80 pounds in Kentucky. So you're talking about traps that need to kill a 70-pound animal is pretty severe size. So the 330 size trap. If you set that off in your hand or arm, it'll cause a good bit of discomfort, potentially break your arm depending on your situation and your size of your person. More importantly, though, things like a dog running through a 330 would potentially cause what we call a non-target kill. And you want to, go a little extra effort to communicate with neighbors and land, about using these traps to make sure folks or pets are not in the areas that you're trapping. There are box traps for these guys that are in existence, and they're large, they're expensive, but they're really effective. You just put them on the slide and they walk right into it. Muskrats. So muskrats, before I forget, you're going to see a lot of the same kind of slides, holes. You'll find feed piles that are little grassy areas and also latrine sites where there's scats present. And you'll see a lot of holes and banks or on the edges of ponds. Muskrats reproduce at incredibly high rates. They can have upwards of 6 to 8 litters a year, and having 4 kits in that litter. So you could have a large population of muskrat right off the bat. You can try to secure banks with rocks. They aren't able to dig into them. And you can try to remove food sources, keep grass cut really short. They get predated on. Muskrats are our favorite food source of mink. So if you make it so the mink can access the area and they can't hide, that'll help. Coyotes will also go after them, and so will bobcats. A lot of times, though, because they reproduce so fast and because their tunnel networks and banks are so extensive, trapping is almost the only mechanism to get rid of them. They are trapped relatively easy with a much smaller version of the body trap. A 110 size will work, or a 160, which is a 2-spring size. It's like a 4x4 that you just put right at their openings of their holes, and you can remove them pretty quick. So unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of non-lethal options for them. I was asked to talk a little bit about feral cats. And real quick, there is a regulatory statute here, the 258.235, which does allow you to protect livestock or humans from cats and dogs as well. However, if you are just trying to remove cats without having any damage on yourself or livestock, it becomes an animal cruelty issue. So lethally, you can't remove them without them actually attacking animals. So the way to kind of approach dealing with feral cats is try to limit the food in the area, and really it comes down to a conversation, usually with neighbors or the community, when you approach this problem. And this is one that, from the wildlife side, we have a big problem with feral cats killing many of our bird species. It's 1 billion birds a year is what they're estimated to take out. Outdoor cats, not just feral cats, but outdoor cats, along with amphibians and small mammals and so on. There's actually a story of a lighthouse keeper that had one cat that caused the extinction of a single shorebird that nested on that lighthouse island. It was the only colony that existed, and the cat killed the entire colony in less than a year. They're incredibly effective hunters. They hunt for fun. Tend to only bring back 1 of 4 on average of the things they kill to their owner, if they bring back any at all. And they don't kill just to eat. They only consume about the same ratio of captures that they bring to their owner. So dealing with these guys, the best thing you do is try to have a conversation with the neighbors, let them know that you're experiencing problems or having issues with them, that you have. Maybe you enjoy watching birds and have bird feeder out, and the neighbor's cat's constantly over there. The best solution for that, unfortunately, is probably take the bird feeder down. You can try to have a conversation with the neighbor about, keeping their cat inside. I personally have 2 cats. I have nothing against cats as long as they're kept indoors. If the neighbors, a bell doesn't work, that's been shown that bells do not work. So that's not a solution. So if the neighbor's not able to keep the cat inside, I would actually suggest taking your bird feeders down. If you have a feral cat colony, so no one actually owns the cats, I would advise you to deal with the problem by trapping that animal and taking it to the local shelter and let the shelter handle it, either by hopefully adopting the animal to someone, or whether it comes down to they don't have the space and they have to humanely euthanize the animal. But it's done in a manner that's, more importantly to you, legal, and also it gives the animal a shot at having adoption. There's a lot of folks that push the trap neuter release program. In almost all the situations, they have been found to basically not successfully lower populations. The idea behind it is good, where you're taking an animal, you're making it so it can't reproduce, and that animal will over time die of natural causes. The assumption of that model is that no other cats are going to show up, and therefore the population won't grow. The problem we see is that immigration of new cats happens whenever there's a colony present. Either by them moving into areas from others, places where they've been released, or folks have a cat that they don't want. They see a bunch of cats around in a colony and they let their cat go. And therefore that cat now can reproduce. It's not been neutered and released. Where it's been successful, they saw really high rates of adoption or really high mortality rates from things like disease. And unfortunately, in almost all cases, they see individuals showing up at these colonies. So it's hard to find a nice happy medium, but my recommendation is to have that conversation with your neighbors if it's their cat, or trap it and take it to the local shelter. Other regulations that you need to be aware of are associated with your ability to protect yourself and your property from wildlife damage. And you have that ability because of KRS 150.170 that gives landowners the right to protect themselves or their property from property damage or from wildlife damage. That means you can take non-lethal and lethal measures to do so. The exemption for this are things like your federally protected species. So all of those bird species, and also, we have our bat species that are federally protected as well. Other things you need to be aware of with this regulation are that if it's an animal that is normally reported by hunters to Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources to get a confirmation number. So your bear, your deer, your elk, and your turkey, you can still deal with an animal, but you still have to get a confirmation number from Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources within 24 hours. That confirmation number does one of two things. A, it allows them to keep track of the issue, and you'd reach out to your local county conservation officer to get that. But in addition to that, when you use this rule, you do not have to let that animal lay. You don't have to waste that animal. So if you harvest a deer that's been causing problems on your property, especially garden or row crops, you can then get that number and take that deer and donate it to Hunters for the Hungry. Or you can give that deer to somebody that needs it, or you yourself can consume it if you need to. We don't want to waste the resource, basically. The catch to this is, yes, you can consume it, but any non-consumptive parts of the animal needs to be either surrendered or destroyed. So bones, or not bones, antlers and fur cannot be consumed. Skulls cannot be consumed. So those have to either be surrendered or destroyed. You cannot keep those. So I've thrown a lot at you here, and I'll be happy to take questions. But in summary, what I want to take away from this is really that there's probably the best way to deal with wildlife damage is to remember that it's going to be a long-term struggle. Try to use a combination of measures to overcome the problem, with the mindset that it's, there's no silver bullet here, and really to have the most impact and being the most successful, you're going to have to use a combination of measures. Identify what's causing that problem. Identify what's causing the problem with your trees. Identify what's causing the problem in your garden. Then use that to move forward. That's really important. And that will help you ensure that you're using tools that are effective on the species that's causing the problem. If you're dealing with things like deer, you need to be thinking about hunting on your property, or you need to be looking at investing in exclosures. That's really your two solutions with dealing with them. And keep in mind that hunting, if you have a property that is 20 acres or more, and you're willing to have someone come on your property, you yourself may not hunt, it could potentially add another income source for you. Kentucky is number 6 in terms of Boone and Crockett, so antler size in the nation. There's a lot of folks that are willing to pay money to try to come in and hunt properties here. But that is a personal choice on your own situation and what you're willing to deal with. And I have some resources that I can help you with if you want to navigate that. But tonight's not the night to get into that. Here's some other resources that are out there. The Nuisance Wildlife Control website allows you to find trappers in your county for certain animals. If you're not, if you need to trap an animal but you don't feel comfortable yourself, they can at least help you locate people that may be willing to come out and help you. They're going to be more likely to help you in winter when the fur is worth something versus the summer. This doesn't mean they're going to do it for free. It just gives you folks that are out there that potentially could help you. There's also the Internet Center for Wildlife Damage Management, which is a universal resource put together about 20 years ago to cover every wildlife species we have in the United States and the damage that they cause and some ways of dealing with that damage. So it's a great tool with that. And then with that, I'll take questions. I see I've got something in the chat. How do I discourage whatever's uprooting my new potted flowers over and over again? Lincoln, that is a really common issue. Let me stop share here and we can go to video. You're probably dealing with a squirrel issue or a chipmunk issue. My bet would be squirrel. Can you tell me, is this, so it's potted flowers. So do you have an ability to move the pots around to a different area? I'm not getting a response from Lincoln. So you could potentially move the pots around, try to get it so where they're not familiar with the location. If they're not consuming the flowers themselves, they're actually probably more looking for bulbs or looking to see if there's any, grubs or whatever underneath those plants that disturb soil. You can try to build miniature cages that, basically are small chicken wire cages that you can set over top of those pots for the initial. No squirrels here. Okay. Well, this cage thing will still work for non-squirrels. It might be chipmunks. You can put the cage over top. So small wire, small hole over top. And that way, the initial disturbance event where they're curious about what's going on, you can get back past that point. And after a couple of weeks, they'll probably lose interest in it. So it's a small exclosure for those individual pots. However, one of the tricks that you can use in this situation to get tracks that I didn't cover is you can actually take your pot when you put it there, wherever, you can lay out a flat surface like a cardboard box, and on a still night, you can put flour on that surface so that the animals that go into it will step in that flour and they'll leave really good tracks that you can use to identify them.
If you have any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. While we're waiting on more questions, I've got one for Rick too. If I can get April to put up the poll, if you all don't care to take a few minutes to fill out this poll. It's over the whole garden series, not just tonight, over the whole series, and we hope you enjoyed it. But while I'm waiting on any more questions, let me scroll back up here. And this one's for Rick. Is this a good, safe idea for a home vegetable garden? A compost facility in Paducah accepts green waste such as bagged or loose leaves, tree trimmings, and brush. The green waste is used as a bulking agent with biosolids from the wastewater treatment plant to produce an enriched soil amendment. Rick, do you care to make a few comments on that one?
Sure. So this is actually quite common, I think, in municipalities to do this sort of thing. I'm not familiar with the Paducah situation. And many people, many cities do this. They release material that is totally safe. But along with that, there has to be a testing program on their end to make sure, that their treatment of these biosolids is going to result in, clean material that's not contaminated with, diseases, or at least diseases that, might be a problem for humans. Surprisingly, another big issue with these biosolids is the presence of heavy metal, so I guess, people sometimes use their toilet as a waste can for things other than, bodily waste. So you do get some heavy metals sometimes on occasion. So, I would just be asking the facility, do you test this? Is it tested for, bacterial contamination? Is it tested for heavy metals? Because they may not be thinking that you're going to use this in a vegetable garden, right? They may be thinking for a landscape situation. I know in certain remote areas, they spray this stuff over, wasteland, what we call CRP lands and stuff. That's, it's not for human consumption, but other cities do have this, that's certified for garden use. So I think I would just follow up with the person that's doing this and ask some of those questions. Is it tested regularly for bacterial contamination and heavy metals? I think that's the two main things you need to worry about.
Thank you, sir. Matt, I'm not sure if this one's in your wheelhouse or not. Any comments on crawdads?
I really wish we had a fishery specialist. I get that one every year. You'd think I'd learn a little bit about it at some point. Unfortunately, can I tell you that it's closer to an insect than it is a wildlife species? So there's a couple publications that are out there on how to deal with them. Virginia Tech has one that's pretty good. It talks a lot about, there's not a lot you can do to not have them. They're going to show up if you have water bodies around. There's some traps that are designed to catch them. But there's not a whole lot that you can do to deal with them, is my understanding. It's more of they're out there. Now it's been like 2 years since I read that publication, so I can't quite remember. What I would say is I can get you that publication and you can go from there, but it's not actually a wildlife species, so I don't deal with it quite a bit. Most of the wildlife species eat that, so I guess get some more raccoons in the area. They'll take care of them for you. Sorry, that's one I wish I could answer, and I really need to learn the answer to it, but it just keeps going over my head year after year.
Well, I appreciate the answer you gave there. I appreciate you all filling out the poll. Hope you all enjoyed the class and seeing some of the results. I think it was pretty popular. Doc, I appreciate both of you. I appreciate you taking time out of the evening to come and help us learn more about gardening for the 2021 growing season. Guys, that if you have any more questions or think any questions, feel free to email me. Feel free to email your local county agent. They are always a great resource to go to, and we love to see people. The COVID has been detrimental on us for seeing everybody we want to do, everybody we want to see. Make sure if you have any comments or anything like that, send them to me. Don't forget our YouTube page. It is recorded. Tonight is, and the whole series is on the Plant Professional YouTube page and will be on the Carter County Ag Extension YouTube page. Other than that, guys, hope you all have a wonderful night, and I will turn it back over to Dr. Springer real quick.
I put that link to that Crawfish Pub in the chat there so that you have it in case somebody on here that wants it.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, that question comes up quite often, and I did not know about that publication, so do appreciate that. Well, other than that, if you two don't care to hang around for a few minutes in case a couple of questions pop up, but I'll let the rest of you go. Y'all have a good night, and we'll catch you in the future.